Good afternoon, guys. At this point, you should already have this graphic organizer filled out. I'm hoping that this video will help clear up any confusion with any of the different psychoactive drug categories, or helping you to identify specific drugs or the behaviors or the mental changes that are made with taking these drugs. Also, hopefully from this video you'll be able to fill in this column if you didn't get that information out of the video that you should have watched. Okay, so right now you may want to dual screen this, have this up, and also the video as we get started here. You also want to get out your yellow notes packet that I gave you in class. Okay, so here we go. Sorry, didn't have this up and ready. So again, we're talking about how do these psychoactive drugs affect the mental processes and behaviors of an individual. Okay? So important for us to first of all understand that psychoactive drugs have an effect on the limbic system, specifically talking about the hypothalamus, the thalamus. When you think about certain drugs, like how they increase appetite or decrease appetite, like this would make sense. Or the hippocampus, how some drugs have an effect on our ability to be able to store memories. And then our amygdala, of course, with our emotions. Now, do realize also that the frontal lobe here is also going to be affected by these drugs, okay? Our thinking, our planning, our organizing, our any type of thought process at all whatsoever, okay? Get the idea. All right, so when we're talking about one of the major drug categories, hallucinogens, okay? What I want you to make sure that you understand is with hallucinogens, it's not just visual senses that can get messed up, it's any of our senses, okay? So we can feel things, not just see things that aren't there, or hear things, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, there's some sort of boundary, okay, between the self and the external world. Now, scientists believe that this is caused by an increase in serotonin levels in the system, okay? So specific examples of drugs that could do this: LSD, most commonly referred to as acid; PCP, psilocybins, most commonly referred to as shrooms; and then of course cannabis. Now do realize cannabis, there's different types of cannabis. You know, there's the hemp plant, and then of course marijuana plants, okay? In this instance, we're most likely going to be talking about marijuana plants. And when it comes to marijuana is kind of tricky as far as classifying it goes, because the problem with it is that the THC that the marijuana plants have in them, it doesn't affect just like one specific neurotransmitter, okay? So it's going to do some things like it can create hallucinations in high doses, very high doses. So some textbooks will categorize it as a hallucinogen, but then it also depresses the system and slows the system down. So it has some effects on GABA. And then, of course, it also can act as a painkiller, which I'm sure you're familiar with, like people who have glaucoma could smoke marijuana to help with the pain effects of that. So it's also going to play a role in increasing endorphins as well. So this is why it's kind of tricky. Do we classify it as a hallucinogen, a depressant, an opiate? It's in limbo, okay? So just be aware of that. All right, moving on. Depressants. Please, please, please. Depressants have nothing to do with making you sad, okay? Depressants slow the body down. They slow the thinking processes. They slow your ability to move your muscles and inhibit your ability to be able to move your muscles and to be able to think. They do that by increasing GABA production in your system. They also can play a role in decreasing dopamine and norepinephrine as well, depending upon the type of depressant that we're talking about. But when we're talking about alcohol, alcohol is going to increase GABA, slowing the system and increasing inhibitions. Okay? Now, some terms that you're going to need to know as far as examples of depressants. You need to know what a barbiturate is. Now, you want to put down in your notes, a barbiturate is sleeping pills, essentially. Okay? They're going to slow the system down to a point where, and of course, decrease those norepinephrine levels to a point where somebody is able to fall asleep. Now, do realize that barbiturates do not give you a good quality night's sleep, okay? Alcohol does the same thing. It blocks your ability to be able to get a good quality night's sleep by knocking you out, okay? It's also going to have barbiturates and alcohol, benzodiazepines as well. It's going to play a role in your ability to be able to remember things as well, because it doesn't allow you to have a good quality night's sleep, so you don't have that consolidation taking place during your sleep cycle. That's necessary. All right. Benzodiazepines. Oh, by the way, sleeping pills are also addictive. So your doctor probably, if they would prescribe that to you, they probably would not prescribe that for a very long period of time. I think I read somewhere like around 2 weeks. Now, when we're talking about benzodiazepines are tranquilizers. You might be familiar with them, like Xanax or Valium, okay? Given to people to calm them, to relax them, like if you're going to get on a plane and you're afraid of flying. But it's also for people with anxiety disorders or special diazepines, to be able to specifically decrease norepinephrine to calm people down, okay? All right, now I also have some examples here in red: morphine, codeine, heroin. Now, these specific examples, these are special opiates, okay? Now, opiates, remember, are going to increase endorphin levels. You want to put down on that chart, that graphic organizer of yours. We put them in the depressant category because they do slow the system down, but they're special, and so we call them opiates because they also have pain-relieving properties, increasing endorphins, therefore creating euphoric feelings, okay? So you may have seen codeine, like maybe if you've had some sort of surgery or something, your doctor prescribes this to you as a painkiller. We used to use morphine a lot in hospitals, but because these are so addictive, opiates in general, they really try to limit the consumption of them. Can you say Brett Favre, codeine? Anyways, but look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. So, anyways, heroin addiction, okay, is pretty high with these, just like barbiturates, okay, as far as creating that euphoric feeling. With heroin, we're also going to have some special effects. It makes people, it increases their appetite. It makes people seek out pleasure, like food and sex and those types of things. So it's very painful when people have to break their addiction to these types of drugs, because the body begins to crave it, and so they go through withdrawal symptoms. All right, anyways. Moving on. Next category is stimulants. Now, a stimulant, stimulate the body, okay? That's what we're talking about here. So if you take a look here, we're talking about drugs like cocaine. Amphetamines are, of course, meth, if you're not familiar with that term, so you might want to put that down in your notes. MDMA is ecstasy. And then these kind of shock us to see us in a psychoactive drug category: caffeine and nicotine. Most abused drug in the United States, caffeine, actually. Now, these types of drugs are going to increase dopamine like crazy, creating a high pleasurable feeling and causing us to seek these drugs out more. They cause withdrawal symptoms, and they're highly addictive. Highly, highly addictive. They can also increase norepinephrine levels, if that makes sense, as far as increasing our alertness and our awareness, if we're speeding up our mental processes here. They can stimulate the production of ACH and endorphins. So, something to be aware of. If you're interested in learning about more illicit substances that we did not talk about, this is a fantastic website for you to check out. All right, something that you also need to understand is that the drugs that we are talking about are not causing the mental and behavior changes in the individual. It's actually the neurotransmitters that we've been talking about this entire year that are creating the behaviors, okay? We have to understand that. What the drugs do is increase or decrease their levels to cause the behaviors. So let's take a look at how the drugs do that. So a drug like meth, for example, is going to it's going to affect the amount of neurotransmitters that are released into the synaptic gap. What it's going to do is it's actually going to stimulate these vesicles. If you see here, it's going to stimulate these vesicles to produce more dopamine than what they normally would. And so what will happen is the dopamine floods this synaptic gap, and there's so much of it that when reuptake takes place, there's a bunch of it that's left in the synaptic gap, and that gets absorbed into the bloodstream, creating the effects that dopamine has on the body, affecting our reward centers and creating that pleasurable feeling, besides just the firing of that feeling as well. Okay, some drugs block reuptake, which creates their effects. Cocaine, for example. Now, cocaine is special because cocaine not only blocks reuptake, but it also stimulates dopamine production. Now, if you know anything about cocaine, what happens with cocaine is you get a very, very quick, very intense high, okay? And this is actually why people OD from cocaine so much, is because the high is actually very short, but really, really good. And that's why people are just taking more and more of it because they want that high, but it only lasts for a short time. All right, anyways, so the cocaine will stimulate these vesicles to produce the neurotransmitter into the synaptic gap, and then the cocaine blocks the receptor sites so that the transmitting neuron can't suck that neurotransmitter back up into the terminal button. So you have like a double amount of dopamine in the synaptic gap to be absorbed into the bloodstream, which creates that really quick, intense high. Now, some drugs, like LSD, what they do is they'll block the reuptake of some receptor sites, like serotonin pathways that are in the brain, and then in other pathways in the brain, they'll excite and produce lots of serotonin, flooding the synaptic gap. And so what happens is this weird imbalance, and that's what scientists think causes the hallucinations. And lastly, some of the drugs will mimic neurotransmitters. And basically here what I mean by that is, let's say that this is the drug, okay? And what it will do is it will pretend, let's say, to be dopamine, but it's not exactly dopamine. And so it will cause the dopamine networks to fire, even though the dopamine networks are not supposed to be firing. So it will go into the synaptic gap and touch the receptor site of a neuron, causing the neural reaction to take place, the neuron to send the message, essentially, when it really never was supposed to, creating certain effects. Ooh, there's that effect. Oh, Brianna, did you get excited? Okay, so I'm sure we all know that drugs can enter the body in many different ways, but what I want you to understand is that when it comes to being able to get things, a lot of concentration of the drug into the brain over a given time, injection will get lots of the drug to affect the neurotransmitters into the brain, but inhalation will get it there quicker. Okay? All right. And then, last but not least, you have to realize that when people take drugs, they can never get the initial euphoric high feeling that they got the very first time. They're constantly chasing that first high, but their body is never going to let them get that. Okay? And this is what causes a lot of people to OD, because at some point, what happens is those synaptic gaps are flooded so much that the system can only absorb so much into the bloodstream before it reaches a point that it's not going to have an effect anymore, and the effect actually, instead of creating feelings of pleasure or euphoria, become toxic for the body, and that's when people OD or die. Okay? All right, now, I don't want to insult your intelligence with knowing what dependence and addiction is, okay, or even what tolerance is. But I do want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between physical dependence and, of course, psychological dependence. Physical dependence, your body craves it, you want to write it down in your notes, and will cause withdrawal symptoms for the body. The withdrawal symptoms are like the throwing up and the fevers and the chills and pain. I mean, pain in some cases because the body craves the drug so much. Okay? Whereas a psychological dependence is more about thinking that you need to have the drug. Okay? Which is a pretty big difference between your body actually craving it and needing it to survive. So, that ends our discussion about psychoactive drugs. And what you need to do now is you need to go ahead and go to your, there we go. I was afraid that I was going to end the video here. You want to go to Edmodo, and you want to go ahead and make sure that you take this test here and have questions for me if you do right before we take the test on Monday, and spend the rest of your weekend studying for that. Have a good one. See you on Monday.